It started on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind of day you don't realize will change everything until it's already too late. I was digging in the backyard, turning over heavy clumps of earth for a garden bed I'd been planning for weeks. The air was humid, the sky low and gray, and every scrape of the shovel seemed to echo louder than it should have. That's when the metal blade hit something solid. At first, I thought it was just a stone, common enough in this old neighborhood. But when I knelt down and brushed the dirt away with my hands, I uncovered something smooth, cold, and unnervingly delicate. It was a doll. Porcelain, cracked along one side of its pale face, but otherwise bizarrely untouched by time. Its glassy blue eyes stared up at me, wide and wet-looking, as if it had been waiting. Its tiny mouth was slightly open, painted in a chipped red smile that seemed wrong, too knowing, too real. I should have reburied it. I should have walked away. Instead, like some fool under a spell, I pulled it out of the ground and brought it inside. I didn't want it in my house, of course I didn't, but something about abandoning it felt worse. Like leaving it out there would somehow invite something even worse inside. So I wrapped it tightly in an old towel, tucked it into a locked storage cabinet in the garage, and tried to forget about it. That night, the house felt different. Heavy, pressurized. Every creak of the floorboards set my teeth on edge. Still, exhaustion won out. I fell into a restless sleep, the faint scent of damp earth still clinging to my skin. At 3:07 a.m., I woke up, heart hammering, with the chilling, unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. There, sitting neatly on my nightstand, just inches from my face, was the doll. Still cracked, still smiling, and somehow, impossibly, still damp with soil. The next morning, I told myself it had to be a mistake. Sleepwalking, maybe. Some weird lapse in memory. I threw the doll back into the garage cabinet, this time wrapping it in duct tape and locking the door with a padlock. I even pushed a heavy workbench in front of it just for good measure. I needed proof I wasn't losing my mind. That night, I set up the old security cameras my brother had left behind when he moved out. Grainy, outdated, but enough to watch the garage in real time. Enough to put my paranoia to rest. Or so I thought. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Motion detected in the garage. Heart thudding painfully in my chest, I pulled up the live feed. At first, the screen was static, flickering, as if the camera was struggling to focus. Then, through the snowy image, I saw it. The doll, standing upright on the garage floor. It moved with a sickening, stuttering jerk, limbs bending too far back, like a marionette with its strings tangled. It turned its cracked face toward the camera, toward me, and the feed went black. I sat frozen in my bed, clutching my phone so hard it could have cracked in my hand. Minutes dragged by. The silence in the house felt alive, pressing against my ears. Then, ever so faintly, I heard the creak of a floorboard downstairs. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found bruises blooming across my arms and legs. Tiny, perfect bruises shaped like fingerprints. Child-sized fingerprints. I wore long sleeves to cover them, too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening. When I did finally break down and show a few close friends the marks, they laughed it off, told me it must be stress or sleepwalking again. But when they saw the footage, the doll walking, their faces turned pale. Still, no one offered to stay the night. No one wanted to be near me. And somehow, that made it worse. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. The doll didn't want them. It wanted me. By the third night, sleep wasn't an option anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, the house seemed to breathe around me, walls expanding and contracting with a soundless pressure that curled against my skin. It started with the softest hum, like the buzzing of bees buried deep in the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster once, thinking maybe it was faulty wiring or old pipes. But what I heard wasn't mechanical. It was voices, high-pitched, whispery, singing words in a language I couldn't recognize. Twisting, lilting, childlike, at first almost sweet, then dark, sliding into a rhythm that felt all wrong, like a nursery rhyme meant for funerals. The first time it happened, I blamed exhaustion. I shoved in earplugs, buried my head under the pillows. But nothing blocked it out. And then the dreams began. I found myself trapped in endless corridors of dirt and roots, digging frantically with bare hands, the taste of soil thick in my mouth. Above me, a child cried, soft and pitiful, and a woman screamed my name over and over, her voice hoarse with terror. I would wake up gasping for air, fists clenched so tightly around invisible objects that my nails gouged bloody half-moons into my palms. Every time I jolted awake, the doll had moved. First, it sat quietly at the foot of my bed, its head tilted as if listening to my heartbeat. Then it perched on my dresser, hands reaching outward in a frozen grasp. Then, one awful night, I woke to find it sitting on my chest, its tiny porcelain fingers brushing my throat. It smelled of damp earth and something older, something rotten. I threw it across the room with a strangled scream. It hit the wall with a dull crack and fell into a crumpled heap. But when I turned on the lights, it was gone. Not broken, not shattered, just gone. And somewhere deep inside the walls, just behind the drywall, I could still hear the soft, giggling lullaby starting up again. I couldn't take it anymore. After another night of whispered lullabies and waking up with dirt under my fingernails, though I hadn't left my room, I knew I needed answers. I needed to know what I had dug up and why it wouldn't leave me alone. The neighborhood had always felt a little forgotten. Shabby houses leaning too far into their fences, yards full of dead leaves and rusted swing sets. It didn't take long to find someone who had lived here long enough to remember. Her name was Mrs. Tellerman, a wiry old woman who lived 3 houses down. I had seen her watching from her porch before, always smoking thin cigarettes with trembling fingers. When I knocked on her door, she answered before I could even lower my hand, as if she had been expecting me. "You dug it up, didn't you?" she said, her eyes narrowing into thin, glittering slits. No greeting, no hesitation, just that flat, accusing question. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She motioned for me to come inside. The inside of her house smelled like mothballs and something sour. The windows were nailed shut, heavy curtains drawn across every wall. She shuffled to an ancient recliner, sat down hard, and lit another cigarette with shaking hands. "You shouldn't have disturbed it," she said hoarsely. "That ground back there, it's cursed, marked, ever since the Warrens disappeared." I frowned. "The Warrens?" She gave a dry, mirthless laugh. "The first ones. Lovely family. Moved here in '72. Started digging a swimming pool in the backyard. And then they were gone. Vanished. No note. No bodies. Nothing." Her voice dropped to a whisper. And they weren't the only ones. Over the next hour, Mrs. Tellerman recounted stories that chilled me more than any whispered lullaby. 3 families, all gone. always after some kind of digging in the backyard. No investigation ever found a clue. The houses would sit empty for a few years, then the bank would quietly resell them. Life would move on, until the next family tried to improve the land. She stubbed out her cigarette and fixed me with a gaze so sharp, made me flinch. "If you dug something up, sweetheart," she said, voice shaking, "you didn't find an artifact. You found a tether. And it's not going to stop with bruises and bad dreams." When I asked what I should do, she only said, "Some things you don't unearth without consequences. You'll see." I left her house with a pit yawning in my stomach, the heavy, oppressive air clinging to me like a second skin. I knew, no matter how badly I wanted to, I couldn't undo what I'd already done. And when I returned home, I found muddy footprints, tiny, doll-sized footprints, leading from the front door all the way to my bedroom. I had no more options. The whispers were louder, the bruises more frequent. Every night, the doll moved closer, watching me with eyes that seemed to know things no living thing should. I was trapped in my own home with something that wasn't alive, and yet it knew me. It fed off my fear, my frustration, and there was no escaping it. Desperation can make you do things you never thought you'd consider. I had heard enough. Mrs. Tellerman's warnings haunted me like a noose around my neck, but at this point, it didn't matter. I needed to end it, once and for all. I was going to burn the damn thing. That evening, I took the doll from the locked cabinet, my hands trembling, and wrapped it in a rag soaked with gasoline. I carried it to the bonfire pit in the backyard, where I had planned many other harmless fires before. The flames had always been comforting, like watching a piece of the world break down in front of me. But tonight, the fire was different. It felt hungry. I set the doll in the center, the gasoline soaking into its cracked porcelain skin. For a long moment, I just stared at it. I expected the familiar static stillness. I didn't expect the faint whimper, like a child calling softly from the wreckage of that twisted, cracked smile. I struck the match. The fire caught quickly, flaring up with a violent intensity that surprised me. The wind picked up, pushing the flames higher, faster, until the heat felt like it was searing my skin. It should have been a release from the suffocating terror that had been clawing at me for weeks. Instead, it felt like something was pushing back, like I had made a terrible mistake. The flames roared, twisting in unnatural shapes. I could feel something pulling at me, tugging at my gut as the fire danced higher. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if the flames were drawing me in, pulling my thoughts into the depths of the fire. I heard a faint, agonized scream, my scream, cut short by the crackling inferno. Then, as quickly as it started, the fire died. The flames went out as if they'd been smothered, leaving only embers in their wake. The doll, now just charred remnants of blackened porcelain, was still there, whole. The unmistakable smile still there, painted with soot and ash, but alive. I blinked, heart racing, but when I looked again, the doll was gone. The smoldering ashes were all that remained. I stumbled back, a chill seizing me from the inside out. I didn't know what was worse, that the doll had survived or that, somehow, it had already been here. I returned to the house in a daze, shutting all the doors behind me, but the air was different. The walls felt closer, tighter. And then, from behind me, a voice, soft, barely audible, like a whisper from the grave. "Come find me." The nightmares started again, sharper this time. At first, I could brush them off as a byproduct of the fire, the stress, the fear. But as the days passed, the dreams bled into my waking reality, unrelenting and vivid. I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I dreamed of my hands, my bloodied, raw hands, digging deep into the earth, faster and faster, as if I were racing against something unseen. The soil was thick, like wet clay, pulling at my fingers as I forced them deeper. My nails tore, my knuckles cracked, but I couldn't stop. The deeper I went, the colder it became, like the earth was swallowing me whole. And in the distance, I could hear it, the sound of shovels scraping against stone, the sickening click of bone against bone. I would wake, gasping for air, my hands shaking, my heart pounding as if I had just sprinted miles in the dark. But every time I looked at my hands, they were covered in dirt, the same cloying, heavy earth that had seeped into my dreams. No matter how many times I washed them, it didn't come off. The dirt stayed under my skin, in my cuticles, beneath my nails. And then, one morning, after a night filled with more of those terrible digging dreams, I woke to a soft scraping sound at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the walls groaning, but the sound was persistent, growing louder, like something or someone was scratching the floor, dragging something behind it. I turned toward the sound, my stomach twisting into knots, and that's when I saw it, a pile of dirt. Not on the floor of the bedroom, but in my bed. It was fresh, wet, like it had been dug up only hours ago. I could smell it, the sharp, acrid scent of earth, the smell of old, decayed things buried deep underground. My heart skipped a beat, and then, buried underneath the mound of dirt, was something that didn't belong, another doll. Its porcelain face, cracked and chipped, was half covered in the mud, but its wide, vacant eyes stared straight at me, unblinking. It was the same doll, the same twisted, unsettling grin, except it was now cracked in a different place, a place that looked new. I staggered back, horrified. How had it gotten there? I had locked the bedroom door. I had locked the house. But there it was, waiting for me, this new doll, buried in the dirt I hadn't even dug. I tried to move it. I tried to throw it away. But every time I did, it returned. And now it had come to me. The doll was changing me. I could feel it in the hollow of my bones, in the way the air around me grew thick and stifling. Every night, the whispers came louder now, clearer, almost like a chant. I tried to ignore them, tried to tell myself they were just echoes in the house, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just the house talking. It was the earth itself, the walls, the floors, all calling to me, urging me to go deeper. And I did. I couldn't help it. It started with the basement. The floorboards had always creaked, but now they groaned with something more, something desperate. I felt it beneath my feet, an urge, a pull toward the concrete, like something was pushing from below, just waiting to break through. My mind was spinning. Everything felt out of control, but I had to go down there. I had to dig. I spent hours in that dank, cold space, pacing the floor in a haze. The air was thick with mold and dust, and the shadows seemed to twist at the edges of my vision. But in the center of the basement floor, there was something strange. The boards didn't feel right underfoot. They were loose, uneven, soft. I grabbed a crowbar and pried up the boards with shaking hands. The splintered wood scraped against the concrete like nails on a chalkboard, making my teeth ache. But when I finally lifted the last piece of wood, I found what I was looking for. A trapdoor, small, nearly invisible beneath the floorboards. A thin layer of dirt caked the edges, like it had been sealed for decades. I reached for the handle, but as soon as my fingers brushed the metal, something cold and sharp shot through me. A cold wave of dread I couldn't explain. A whisper in my ear, "Don't open it." But I didn't listen. I couldn't. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, suffocating staircase that led down into the blackness. The air was colder than anything I had ever felt, thick with the smell of rot and decay. Something was down there. I could feel it in my bones. With every step, the silence pressed in, and the darkness stretched further than it should have. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was a void, hungry, waiting abyss. And then I saw it. A small, sealed-off room, barely large enough for a child to fit into. The walls were lined with shelves, shelves covered with dolls. Dozens of them, all in different states of disrepair, but all with one thing in common. They had human teeth sewn into their mouths. It was as if the dolls were feeding. But feeding on what? I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. But then something caught my eye. A scrap of fabric, yellowed and tattered, poking out from behind one of the dolls. I reached for it, and as I pulled it free, my hands trembled with the weight of what it was, a child's dress, stained with something dark, something old. A scream rose in my throat, but I couldn't release it. The doll's eyes were all watching me now, their broken, gaping mouths frozen in permanent, toothy grins. And deep in the center of the room, there was a handprint on the wall. Small, childlike, freshly smeared in dirt. Something had been here recently. Something small. Something alive. And as I backed away from the room, the trapdoor slammed shut behind me with a sickening, final thud. The house was alive now, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The walls were closing in. I could feel it, the pressure mounting in my chest, the tight grip of fear digging into my ribs, making it harder to breathe. The dolls were everywhere now. It was as though they had multiplied overnight. They were in every room, on every surface, some perched on shelves, others placed carefully on chairs or windowsills, their faces twisted into those grotesque, silent smiles. It had been weeks since I found that hidden room beneath the house, but the terror had only grown. The dolls were no longer just objects. No, they were something far worse. They were vessels. Vessels for the souls of the families who had disappeared, the Warrens, the Mitchells, the Albrights, each one absorbed by the earth, twisted into these things that couldn't rest. They were reaching for me, clawing to come back, to live again. I felt their cold fingers in my mind, pulling at the corners of my thoughts, whispering to me in voices that weren't my own. I spent days searching for answers, scouring the local archives, piecing together scraps of old newspaper articles, and listening to Mrs. Tellerman's warnings echoing in my head. But the more I uncovered, the worse it got. The families hadn't just vanished, they'd been taken, their souls trapped in the dolls by some dark, ancient force tied to this land. Each family, each soul, desperately trying to escape. And now, they were trying to escape through me. It began with small things, an occasional whisper, a momentary lapse in time where I would find myself in the wrong place, doing something I didn't remember starting. My reflection in the mirror wasn't always my own. Sometimes I would see the faint outlines of other faces, faces I didn't recognize, staring back at me with hollow eyes. And then the dolls began to speak, not with words, but with actions, with intent. I woke one morning to find one of them, the smallest doll, the one I had found buried the deepest in the earth, on my pillow. It wasn't just sitting there, waiting like the others. It was holding something, a note written in a scrawl I didn't recognize. Come play with us. It was the first time I had ever felt a true sense of loss. A part of me, deep inside, wanted to run, to escape, to leave everything behind. But every time I moved to pack my things, every time I turned my back, there they were, always watching, always waiting. It was then that I realized the dolls weren't haunting me. They weren't just trying to scare me. They were trying to possess me. I had become the host, the vessel they needed to escape their prison. Each night, the pull grew stronger, the whispers more insistent. I couldn't tell what was my own mind anymore, or what belonged to them. My thoughts were no longer my own. I was a puppet, strung up by invisible threads, tugged in all directions by their hunger. I didn't know how much longer I could fight it. The dolls were everywhere, crawling through the cracks of my reality, pulling at my skin. The line between the living and the dead had blurred. There was no escape. There was no going back. I wasn't just being haunted anymore. I was becoming them. I woke up in a place that wasn't my own. I didn't know what day it was anymore. The hours bled together, stretching into one long, unbearable haze. My reflection in the mirror didn't belong to me. It couldn't. It was someone else's face, someone else's eyes. I stood there, frozen, unable to look away from the stranger in the glass. My skin was too pale, too sickly. My eyes, they were wrong. They were wide, too wide, staring back at me with an expression I didn't recognize. It, whatever it was, whoever it was, smiled at me, a cold, twisted grin that sent shivers up my spine. I wasn't me anymore. It started slow at first. Little shifts. A voice inside my head that wasn't mine, whispering things I couldn't control. Words that had no place in my mind. I had started speaking in tongues, old, forgotten languages. I'd hear the words spill from my lips, but they weren't my own. I would find myself in different parts of the house, hours having passed, with no memory of how I got there. My body was acting on its own. My mouth moved without my consent. And when I looked into my eyes, I could feel them. They were there, watching, waiting, waiting to take me completely. The dolls, they were always there, watching, waiting, as though they knew what was coming. Their glassy eyes followed my every movement. But they weren't just watching me anymore. No, they were watching us. The voices, the souls of the lost families, they were starting to blend with my own. I could feel them pressing in, filling me, and I couldn't fight it. Not anymore. It wasn't enough to simply haunt me now. They were taking me. They wanted to be me. I could hear their voices in my head clawing at my thoughts, demanding that I surrender. Their whispers were getting louder, merging with my own, until I couldn't tell where I ended and they began. There was no longer a clear boundary between me and them. Their hunger, their desperation to escape the confines of the dolls, filled me. They were so close to breaking free, so close to using me as their vessel. And it was working. I stood in front of the mirror again, trying to tear my eyes away from the reflection. My face was changing, shifting. It was no longer just their eyes that stared back. It was all of them. I could hear the dolls, their voices coming through me, come back to us. They were already inside me. I spoke without meaning to, the words tumbling out, a chorus of voices blending with my own. We are free. The laughter that followed wasn't mine. It was theirs. The laughter of the lost, the hungry souls trapped for years, free, and now inhabiting my body. I wasn't me anymore. I couldn't remember who I was. All I knew was that the dolls were smiling, and they were inside me now. I ran. I don't remember how or why, but all I knew in that moment was that I had to get out. The house, the walls that had once been my sanctuary, had become a cage, a tomb. The dolls were everywhere now, creeping into the corners, pulling at my limbs. They weren't just watching anymore. They were moving, shifting, reaching for me with their tiny hands, crawling through the shadows. I tried to escape. I thought if I just left the house, maybe the voices would stop. Maybe the nightmare would end. But the moment I stepped out the front door, I felt it, like a noose tightening around my neck, pulling me back. The air outside was thick, stifling, as though the house itself was holding me in place. I stumbled forward, gasping for breath, but something in the back of my mind told me I wasn't running away from the dolls anymore. I was running towards something far worse. I don't remember the exact moment when I stopped, when my body gave in to the overwhelming force that pulled me back toward the house. But I know I didn't make the choice. I couldn't. They made it for me. I looked up and saw the house looming in front of me, its windows dark and empty, but inside, I could feel it. The presence. It wasn't just the dolls anymore. It was me. They were inside me, all of them. I walked back through the door, no longer fighting, no longer able to resist. I entered the living room, and that's when I saw it. The doll. But it wasn't just a doll anymore. It looked exactly like me, a perfect porcelain replica, but with those same hollow eyes, the same eerie smile, and the same empty gaze that had been haunting me for so long. Its hands were folded neatly in its lap, as if waiting for me. I froze, unable to breathe, my heart racing in my chest as I took in the sight of it. The doll didn't just look like me. It was me. The face, the expression, the shape of the body, everything. It was a twisted, soulless version of who I had been. I staggered backward, horrified, but as I turned to flee, I felt it. The cold fingers of the dolls pressing against my skin, their tiny hands grabbing at me, pulling me closer, dragging me toward the floor. And then I heard it. The voice. Welcome home. It wasn't my voice. It was all of their voices, layered on top of one another, whispering through me. The voices of the lost families, now trapped forever inside me in this new form. I could feel their hunger, their desperation. They were in me, and I was becoming them. The door opened with a sharp creak, and my neighbor, Mrs. Tellerman, appeared on the porch. She had seen the house go dark. She had seen me disappear. But she didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked at the doll on the porch, the one that looked like me, and smiled. She knew what had happened. She knew what I had become. Weeks later, the house sat abandoned, silent. The neighbors whispered about the strange, unsettling feeling that had overtaken the street. No one ever saw me again. And then, one morning, a new doll appeared on the porch of the house, an exact replica of me, sitting in the same spot the original had been. But this time, it wasn't just a doll. It was me, a perfect porcelain replica of the person who had once lived there. The person who had once been me,